So up until now, we've been using the Django ORM, but we've been using that entirely in the context of database management, when Django is much more than that. Django is a web framework for Python. So a web framework is essentially just a library. And a library is nothing more than thousands of lines of code that someone else wrote ahead of time to make our job easier. So a framework is actually many different libraries. And most websites we see online today typically use two or more frameworks. Usually they'll have one framework taking care of the backend, and that could be Django, and also Ruby on Rails is another very popular one. Node as well. And then they'll have a different framework taking care of the front end, usually JavaScript. So React, Angular, Backbone, there are dozens of them. Django and Ruby on Rails, these are full stack solutions. By default, they are designed to create an entire web app, front end and back end, but they are typically kind of found to be too slow for the modern web user. So that's why the kind of paradigm of having a front end framework and a back end framework paired together has become so popular. So today we're going to be learning how to use Django as a full stack framework. So handling both front end and back end, but later on we'll be learning how to use Django as just an API backend layer, and then have React on the front end. So yes.
I'm sorry. Is there a distinction between a website and a web app?
Yes. Typically, a website is not interactive, and a web application is. So at any point of so anything where you find yourself, making an account, creating new content, that's a web application. So Facebook and Twitter and GitHub, those are all web apps. A website is essentially static, or at least typically you don't post data to it.
Okay, so interactive means you're posting data in terms of websites?
In this particular case, that's what I mean. You can also have like an interactive site, like there's like a little game you can play on it or something like that. But when I say interactive, I do mean, you are like actively altering the data contained by the web application in some way.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So I'm going to do a couple of things to kind of go over this. A lot of this you're familiar with. And I'm going to do things like I want to figure out if I have Python or Django already installed. So I'm going to do python-m Django-version. You can see the version. And if you don't see that, you should pip install Django. I'm not going to do that now because installing Django can take a while. And then I can, start a new project. So I'm going to Django admin. I'm going to start a project. I'm just going to call it my site. There it is. I'm going to go into it and make a virtual environment. I'm going to activate that virtual environment. And I'm going to install Django here, just so, make sure everything don't have any weird, problems with that. I should just be able to install Django right away. And this, usually if you've installed Django globally, you won't necessarily have to reinstall it on pip, unless for this particular project you plan on using a different version of Django, which may be the case. I'm gonna open this up in code-r. I'm going to take a little bit of a deeper look at all of these things that Django gives us when we create a new Django site. So you look here. Thank you very much. So at the top layer, we've got manage.py. So manage.py is not something we ever want to mess with. And it has essentially all of our command line utilities come from manage.py. So if we're running Django admin, or we'd run Python manage py, that gives us everything. And again, you never really want to mess with manage.py. It's written this way for a reason, and we don't want to, break our ability to create migrations or applications or anything like that. We also have this dunder init It's an empty Python file. All it does is it just tells this that this directory should be considered a Python package. Again, we don't need to mess with this. Then we've got settings.py. And settings.py we have messed with a bit. This is kind of the, let's see, how best describe this. This is the file that tells Django things like what apps are installed, what database to use, all of that. So this is something you will mess with as you want to change certain ways of how your Django application runs. Sorry, 1 second. We also have this, URLs. So these are the the URL declarations. It's kind of a tangle. Think of it as a table of contents for your Django-powered site. So it's sometimes called the URL dispatcher. And so we can see what's already there. At the moment, we've got these imports. We've got this array called URL patterns, which has something called path admin, admin.site URLs. So all of our routes that say, when we actually visit our website, they kind of get routed through urls.py. And then we've got this WSGI. This is a file that you don't really need to know too much about. It's essentially what we need to fire the app up on different types of servers. So this is something kind of like manage.py. We don't want to mess with it. It's kind of there just to make sure that everything works the way it should. Also just realized that this thing, again, didn't put me in the virtual environment when I used code. I don't know why it does that. So, sorry, brain fart. There we go. So that's kind of what Django gives us when we first start it up. And this is technically all we really need to start a Django website. So we can create a server by running python manage.py run server. And it says we have some unapplied migrations, but we don't need to worry about that because we have no real migrations to apply yet. And it says here, starting developer server at HTTP 127.0.0.1 8000. And so does anyone recognize what this is, this 127.0.0.1?
Local host.
Yep, that's our local host. Nope.
They also call it a loop back address because it loops back to your computer that you're on.
Yep. And so localhost is essentially a virtual server that we can run. And the number afterwards is a port saying, where specifically it's running. You can have multiple localhost ports running at the same time. And by default, Django will have your localhost port be 8000. So if I go to localhost 8000, it says, hey, the install worked successfully, congratulations. You can see this page because debug equals true in your settings file and you have not configured any URLs. So this is essentially a default Django landing page that is provided to us by default if we don't have anything else. So this is the web application that we just created. It's just kind of this default homepage. But of course, if everything's working right, we shouldn't be seeing this. We should actually, create an application so that we can visit our website and get some functionality. Any questions so far about Django? I know all the setup stuff is stuff we've kind of gone over before.
What was the command to run the program?
It was python manage.py and then run server, all one word.
Thank you.
No problem.
And right now it's set to localhost. So if we wanted to, let's say we have a server that's connected somewhere, some way that, some service provider, we go into settings and change that under the server.
You could do that. Another way to do that is you can actually do something like this. I can do python manage.py run server, and then I'm going to write 0.0.0 6.0. I could do 8001. And that tells it, hey, start the server at 8001 instead of the default 8000. So I refresh this, the site can't be reached, but if I go to 8001, it's running here now instead. And to stop the server, we just do Control-C. Put this back to localhost 8000, even though there's nothing running there anymore. All right, so I'm going to make an application, and remember that a project and an application are kind of two different things. A project can have multiple applications. So I'm going to use Python manage.py, and I'm going to start an app. And I'm going to make an app where you can take polls. So I'm going to call it polls. So whenever we talk about having multiple applications, think of if Google were to be one big Django project, which it definitely isn't. One application might be the search engine, another one might be shopping, another one might be maps. So you can have many applications as part of one site. And let's take a look at what this gives us. So we have a blank init, same thing as the site. We also got stuff like admin.py, which says register your models here. Apps.py, which has this thing. Models.py, this one we're acquainted with. This is where you make your models. There's a test file here ready to go. There's something called views.py. So I'm going to start here. So views.py is kind of where we decide, where we define how our application runs. So I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to say from Django.http, I'm going to import something called HTTP response. And I'm going to make a method called index, which takes something called request as an argument. And I'm going to have it return an HTTP response. And I'm going to call it hello world, welcome to the polls index. So this is going to be something that just says, hey, when we want to visit our index page, we're getting an HTTP response with this content. Next, I'm going to create a new file inside my polls file, because my project already has a urls.py. My application, polls, is going to need its own urls.py file. So I'm going to make a new file called urls.py. And I'm going to start creating a URL for us to visit. So I'm going to say from Django.urls.
So just to clarify, you need you already got a urls.py for the site. This is one for the app.
Exactly.
The same.
And in a little bit, I'm going to show you kind of how these two different URLs files interact with one another. But in general, the one at the site level is kind of considered like a master router, something that sends people where they want to go. And if they go to the polls site, this is going to have all of the specific places they can go after they get to the polls site. So I'm going to, from Django.urls, I'm going to import something called path. I'm also going to say from dot, I'm going to import views. So I'm going to import the entire views.py file. And then I'm going to create a list called URL patterns. It's got to be called URL patterns, otherwise it won't work. And inside that, I'm going to put path. And I'm going to put an empty string. I'm going to put views.index. I'm going to write name equals index. And this path kind of defines, all right, how do we navigate to this particular view? And I'm saying I'm creating a path, and I'm saying that if it doesn't this is the URI, and I'm saying, okay, if there isn't anything after the home page, then that means I want it to go to views.index, which I'm naming index. And you're going to see kind of how this works in a little bit more. I'm going to come back here to my main urls.py, and I'm going to get rid of this from Django.contrib import admin for now. And I'm going to add to this, along with importing path, I'm going to import something called include. And to make sure that this urls.py can kind of be routed to from here, I'm going to write path. I'm going to go to polls/, and I'm going to say include polls.urls. So the idea is, okay, localhost 8000 is my host. And I've made a URL pattern in the main site that says, okay, let's go to polls/. So I should be able to go to /polls. And then I told it, okay, and if they don't put anything after the word polls, take them to views.index. And views.index, we're giving it a name called index so that we can reference it later. And once it gets here to this index method, it'll return this HTTP response. So if I test this out, if I run the server, so if I go to localhost 8000 normally now I'm getting this 404 error because I took out that admin page. So now that I have a new URL, there's nothing here at the base one. But it says right here, Django tried these URL patterns in this order, polls. So it's kind of telling me there's nothing here, but there might be something at /polls. If I do that, there's my HTTP response. Hello world, welcome to the polls index. And the cool thing about the server is you can actually kind of get a log of what actually happens to the server every step. So it showed me that I had a GET request to the home page earlier, and it gave me an error 404. But then I made a request to polls, and it worked out fine. It redirected me to /polls/ and gave me a 200. So I know this is kind of a lot of stuff. Any questions about this so far?
What did you put in the URL bar to get to view hello world?
You mean up here or in one of these?
In the browser.
In the browser, I just did localhost 8000 /polls. So the /polls comes from the main site, from the main project URLs file. And then I just told it, all right, and if there's nothing after the word polls, take them to the index.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
No problem.
Noah, what can be in our patterns? Is it always a string? Can we use regex? What's supported inside a path there for pattern?
So it has to be a string, but you can include what are called kind of wildcards. And I'll show some examples of that later. So say you wanted to visit, our poll application is going to have, questions and answers or questions and choices. So if they want to view a particular question, we'll create a route to say, if you want to view a particular question, here's the pattern. And I'm going to get into that in a bit and want to, work my way up to it, because for now, at this point, we're still just trying to make sure that we can get all of our paths working.
It should be able to accept regex as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I've been looking at so many API libs the last 2 days. I can't keep track of what's doing what.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I want to talk a bit about the database. So in the past, we've been using Postgres, and in the future, we'll continue to use Postgres. I don't feel at this moment, I want to focus more on the Django and not worry about the vagaries of Postgres. So I'm going to be keeping the default here, which is SQLite. And so SQLite is an extremely lightweight database management system. It's essentially a file that we interact with using SQL. So it's kind of one step above a CSV file in some ways. So in the future, you want to make sure that you change it to Django db.backends.postgresql and give it the name of your database. But we're going to skip that step for now because I just want to focus on Django rather than the database at the moment. So next thing I want to do is I want to make the models in models.py. But before I do that, I want to talk about kind of the philosophy, almost, you could call it, behind Django. Django's architecture is based on a pattern that we call MVC, which stands for Model View Controller. And these are 3 layers to our application that dictate how our application works. So Django is an MVC application. Ruby on Rails is also an MVC application. So let me see if I can find a good diagram for this, because it's easier with a visual aid. Give me images, thank you. So here we've got model, view, and controller, and the user. And so generally speaking, the model layer is the data. It's kind of the raw data. It includes our database and includes our models in models.py. And so there's also the controller layer, which is kind of talks about, it's the brains of the application. It handles the logic of what goes where and what data you retrieve and why. And then the view layer is what the user sees. So it says right here, the user uses the controller manipulates the model updates the view, and the user sees the view. And kind of a way I like to describe it is like, think of it like a restaurant. The view is you can call it like, the table and the menu, everything the user sees while they're waiting for their food, and after they get their food, that's the view. The waiter is the controller. You tell the waiter what you want, and the waiter goes and gets it. And then the model is the kitchen. So the waiter goes to the kitchen and says, hey, I need one of these. And the kitchen sends it out, the waiter brings it and updates your view. So now you have your food in front of you. And in Django, our models layer is the models.py. Our views layer is not views.py, which I know is confusing. Our views layer is actually going to live in this directory I'm going to make right now called templates. Oops, not a file. I want to make a directory. So all of our views are going to live in this templates folder. And views.py is actually our controller. If I was designing this, I wouldn't call this views.py, but I'm not, so we're kind of stuck with it. Any questions about MVC architecture? So over the course of this lecture, we're going to learn how these interact with each other on a more permanent basis, because right now we've got a controller, we've got our views. We don't really have any models, and we don't really have a view per se. We've got just this very bare bones HTTP response. So I'm going to add the model layer now. So I'm going to add some actual data that we can interact with. So since this is a poll application, I'm going to make one class called question. And it's going to have a question date or question text. It's going to be a char field. And we'll give it a publication date, models.datetime field. And we'll give it a verbose name like date published. And I'm also going to give choices as a model. So we'll have a choice, and here it's models.model. we're going to make sure that a choice belongs to a question by giving it a foreign key. So a question equals models.foreign key, which is question. On delete is going to equal models.cascade. And we'll give it a related name, which equals choices. We'll give it some text, choice text. Is models.charfield max length equals 200. And we'll give it a number of votes. It's going to be an integer field with a default value of 0. So now that we've created our models, we need to make sure that our application is registered to our project. So I got to go to settings.py and make sure in installed apps, I'm going to add polls. And then once we've done that, we can migrate it. I'll stop the server so we can run python manage.py, make migrations, polls, and then migrate it. And of course, whenever we make a migration, it creates a migrations folder, and it always gives us the first one, which is always called 0001 initial, which includes all of our models, but also everything that's kind of built into Python, into Django. Now that we have some models, I'm going to just quickly set up a nice shell that we can use so we can add some data that we can manipulate. And clear this. I'm going to pip install Django and extensions. Going to add that Django extensions to our installed apps. And then I'm going to run python manage.py shell plus. I'm not going to bother with the IPython this time. It's optional. So if we have a question object, a question class, I should be able to do question.objects.all and get an empty query set. Great. Should be able to do the same thing with choice. Empty query set. Excellent. So now that we have that, I'm going to create a question. So I'll say, I'm going to import something from django.utils first. I'm going to say utils. I'm going to import time zone. Then I'm going to make a new question. I'm going to say question equals question. Question text is going to equal what's new. And the pub date is going to equal timezone.now. So and I'm going to save it. So I should be able to see question.id if it's saved. It automatically got assigned an ID. And I should be able to see question.question text. There it is. And I do question.pubdate. So it gives me this datetime.datetime object. All right. So, and if I just take a look at, question.objects.all again, I see that. So one thing that I'm going to do is calling question.objects.all shows me that I have a question object, but it doesn't tell me anything. It's not descriptive at all. It honestly sucks. So I'm going to add some changes to my model so that I can have something a little more helpful. So I'm going to add a dunder string method here. So def dunder str. And this is just going to change what Django displays when we call question.objects.all. I'm just going to have it return something that says the ID number is self.id. And the question text is now self.question text. And while I'm here, I'll add something to choice as well. Now the return ID is self.id. And choice text is now self.choice text. And because these are methods, I don't need to migrate again. So now if I run python manage shell and run question.objects.all, I should get something a little more descriptive. There we go.
So when you initially call the .all, it tries to return a string representation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the str just says, all right, how are we going to represent this question object? And by default, it'll just say, it's a question. It's a, how did it show it here? Question object. And we can just kind of hijack that str method to say, hey, show us actually what it is rather than just make it a question object.
Why is it saying, like looks like you have choice text there in line 17, but in the thing it has question text?
So choice text is for the choice class, question text is for the question class.
Okay.
So I haven't added any choices yet. And we can fix that though. So if I do, question, well, first I can do, question equals question.objects.first. And if I, do question.choices.all, I should get nothing. So I can create some. So I could say, question.choices.create choice text equals not much. And choices, this command create automatically saves it. So I run question.choices.all. Now I've got that choice here. And I'll make another one, question.choices.create choice text equals the sky. So now my question has two choices. And I'll make one more. Just hacking away. And I should be able to go from a choice backwards as well. So I'm going to do choice equals choice.objects.first. I should be able to do choice.question and see the question. And notice the choice model has a votes. I didn't need to specify how many votes each had because I made sure they had a default value of 0. So I do choice.votes. It's automatically set to 0. What questions do you have so far about the models? As you can see, at this point, the models is something we've worked with already, and not much needs to change about how we actually use our models, because the models can stand on their own. The view and the controller, however, kind of depend more on each other than the models do. All right, so I'm going to move on a bit. So we're going to add 3 new routes to our website. I want to be able to go from, be able to view one single question. I want to be able to see the results of that question. And I want to have a page that will allow me to vote on that question. So I'm going to go to polls urls.py, this one here. And I'm going to add some new routes. And so I remember somebody asked about, how do we want to make, how do we make it more so it's not just hard coded? So what I'm going to do is say, all right, if I wanted to see, the first question, I should be able to go to see something like this, /polls/1. And that should take me to the question with the ID of 1. So the pattern is going to be this. Int, we'll call it question ID, like so. And we're going to send that to views, and we're going to make a method called details, which we haven't created yet. And we're going to give the name of that as detail. And the next one, if I wanted to say, all right, if I wanted to see the results, I should be able to go to /polls/1/results. And that should give me to the results of the poll. So I'll make a path, and I'm going to add that int question ID /results/. I'm going to send that to views.results, which again we haven't created yet, and give it a name of results. And then finally, if I want to be able to vote, I should be able to go to /polls/1/vote. And so that'll take me to path int question ID /vote. And that'll take me to views.vote with a name equal to vote. So this right here is kind of a name. We're essentially naming a variable that we're going to get from the URL. So eventually I want to go to /1, and based on this number that is entered into the URL bar, I should be able to retrieve the question with the URL ID of 1. Now I'm going to go to views.py and make those methods I haven't created yet.
No, back on those URLs, you had it ended with a slash. So what is it? The /1 will work. It doesn't have to be /1/.
Yeah, /1 will work. If there's nothing after it, it'll automatically redirect you to adding that slash here.
Okay.
I had a quick question too while we're here.
Yeah.
So when you vote on something, that's going to be a post request. Like, do you not need to? Sorry, my phone is ringing. Do you not need to specify that that's a post?
Good question. So that we don't have to specify that here in URLs. And one thing we're actually going to be doing is we're going to be having a post request, and we're actually going to be kind of doubling up some of our views, like some of our methods in views.py to handle, okay, what if it's a post request versus what if it's a get request?
Got it, thanks.
No problem. That was very difficult for me to learn because that's very opposed to what they do in Ruby on Rails, and that's what I grew up learning, but this works as well. So I'm going to make a few more methods that are going to do some more HTTP responses. So I'll give this one detail. And detail is going to take a request just like index did, but it's also going to take that question ID as an argument, which comes from the URL bar. So this is going to be passed into our method as question ID. And for now, all I'm going to say is return HTTP response. This is question ID. So I just want to make sure I get these routes working before I actually add any functionality. This is also going to take request and question ID. Return HTTP response. These are the results for question ID. And finally, vote takes in request and question ID. Returns an HTTP response. This is the voting page for question ID. Now we have that. I'm going to fire up my server and check that I can visit these pages. Uh-oh. All right, we have an attribute error. Module polls.views has no attribute details. You got to be consistent. I told it to look for views.details, but I wrote it as detail in my models. sorry, in my views. So I'll change, in this case, I'm going to change this to say, go to view.detail. And it automatically reloads the server when it notices that change. So I don't need to shut down the server and do it again. So we go to /polls, welcome to the polls index. We go to polls 1, this is question 1. If I go to results for question 1, go to vote, this is the voting page for question 1. So cool and all, but not super helpful yet, right? Because it's not really a web application. It's just saying, hey, these are just, namespaces that we've created with plain text. What we want to do is we actually want to make sure that we can, show web pages here, right? The way we're going to do that is through that templates folder I made earlier. And a template is, it's an HTML file, but it has some additional Python functionality that allows us to change how things are rendered. So I'm going to create something called index.html. And I'm going to set it up much like any other HTML document. I'm going to make an h1, call this all polls. And I'm going to tell it to expect something called latest question list. And to kind of put this Python in my HTML doc, I'm going to use this syntax. So I have this kind of brackets and percent signs. And I'm going to say if latest question list. So if one of those exists, I'm going to make an unordered list. And then I want to loop through all the questions I have. So I'll set up another thing right here. I'll set up a for loop. So I'll say for question in latest question list. And I'm going to, inside of each of these, I'm going to put an li. And inside each li, I'm going to put a link tag, an ahref. And in here, I'm going to say, all right, I want to show the question text. So I'm going to put double brackets instead. So question.question text. And then inside the href, I want it to go to the details page. So I'm going to take it to /polls/ bracket bracket question.id, like so. And then to end the for loop, I'm going to put another bracket percent bracket, and I'm going to write end for. So it's like Python, but different. And in general, I also need to make sure that I also have end the if statement by writing end if. So generally speaking, if you have something that you don't actually want to render onto the page, use this bracket percent notation. If you want it to actually show up in the HTML, you use the double brackets instead. But you can still use if statements and for loops and everything like that. You just need to make sure you have end if, end for, because HTML doesn't support the indentation that Python normally uses to keep track of whether or not an if statement is ended. And while I'm here, I'm going to make sure that it renders something if there isn't a latest question list. So I'm going to set up this thing that says else. I'll also have a p tag that says no polls are available. So this template essentially is just a way of saying, all right, this isn't the index for. This allows us to have something ready to go to render our data based on what the data is. So our HTML is now very responsive to the data that we store inside of our model layer rather than our models.py.
Hey, Noah, you don't need to end your else.
No, so we go if else, and then the end if ends both of them.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So next I'm going to go to views.py, and I'm going to tell it in this section, instead of returning an HTTP response, I want it to use something else. So first I need to actually get the latest question list. So I'm going to make a variable called latest question list. I'm going to set that equal to question.objects.orderBy. I'm going to order them by pub date descending. I also need to make sure I'm actually importing the question. So I'm going to say from .models, I'm going to import question. And then in order to pass in this variable to my template, what I need to do is I need to kind of add it to an object that's going to be sent down when I render the page. So I'm going to make a variable called data. I'm going to set that equal to a dictionary. I'm going to say latest question list is latest question list. And instead of returning this HTTP response, I'm going to return render. And I'm going to tell render is going to take request as an argument. It's going to, now I need to tell it where to go. I'm going to tell it to go to polls/index.html. Also, I just realized I messed something up. I'll fix that in just a sec. And I'm going to also make sure I give it the data to get rendered down. And the reason I messed up is I realized that I need to make, it'll look at, by default, it's going to look in the templates folder. And I should make another folder inside templates specifically for polls. So I'll make another folder called polls. I'm going to move index.html inside of it. So now it'll look, this will tell it look inside templates/polls for index.html. So now I should be able to go to /polls. And as we can see here, it's rendered that. It's created this link to /polls/1. I can follow it, go back here. And if I add more questions, they'll also show up here. So we've created our first, actual Django web page now, which is pretty great. What questions do you have so far? Okay, well, I'm gonna do this one more time. I'm going to update our detail page as well so that we can actually see the details when we click on this link. So I'm going to do something similar here. I'm going to say question equals question.objects.get, where ID equals question ID. I'm going to set data to equal this, where question is going to be question. And I'm going to return render with request. I'm going to send it to polls/detail.html, which we haven't created yet. And I'm going to give it the data to pass down with it. Then I'm going to make a new file called detail.html. And let's have it set up so that we can actually see the details about our question. So I can, say details about question.id. Then I can make a subheader that says, what the actual question is. So question.questionText. And then I want to display all of the choices. So I could say UL, then loop through it. So %for choice in question.choices.all. I'm going to render a list item with choice.choiceText. and then end the for loop. So %end for. And if I refresh this page, there's the details of my question. I've got the question, what's new, and all of my choices. Not much, the sky, just hacking away. So let's take a 10-minute break. Be back at 11:15, and we will continue this and build out the rest of our application. Actually, let's make it a 5-minute break because I just realized what time it is. So be back at 11:10. That way we can finish before lunch.